Imagine trying to finish your to-do list, but instead of focusing, your brain keeps whispering, "Don't mess this up." That voice isn't about the task, it's the echo of an old survival strategy, still quietly directing your workday. Recent studies from 2020 through 2025 show that childhood adversity is strongly linked to adult patterns in attention, stress response, and workplace functioning. In this video, we'll uncover how those early stress imprints keep sabotaging your output and share one small practice you can test this week to start breaking the cycle. And the real twist? These patterns don't just fade with age. They show up in how we handle deadlines, meetings, and everyday decisions at work, the hidden price tag of trauma at work. At first glance, many workplace struggles get mistaken for laziness, poor discipline, or a lack of motivation. But what often hides beneath those labels is a nervous system shaped years earlier by experiences of unpredictability or criticism. Instead of moving smoothly through tasks, stress can push people into three familiar patterns: freezing when pressure rises, swinging into overdrive in an attempt to avoid mistakes, or sidestepping tasks altogether because the risk feels too high. These reactions are not choices in the moment so much as survival codes replaying themselves long after the original situations ended. Standard fixes rarely touch this deeper layer. Organizations invest in apps, planners, and focus workshops, assuming the problem is simply time management. But productivity tools can only go so far if someone's nervous system is bracing for danger every time a deadline appears. Companies buy tools, nervous systems need safety, and those aren't the same thing. The measurable price tag shows why this matters. Recent research links childhood adversity to higher error rates under pressure, slower recovery from mistakes, and reduced ability to sustain attention. Economists and public health reviews estimate the lifetime economic burden of childhood maltreatment in the United States at around $124 billion. That number reflects not just healthcare costs, but lost work hours, lower long-term output, and reduced collective productivity. What looks like simple procrastination on one desk can ripple across entire teams as projects drag, morale drops, and timelines expand. A simple example captures the point. In a meeting where quick decisions are needed, one person hesitates. What others see as disengagement is actually their nervous system reacting to memories of being punished for saying the wrong thing. They pause, second-guess, over-edit their words. To an outsider, it appears inefficient. In reality, it is the same protective reflex that once helped them avoid harm. The mismatch between what's visible and what's actually happening defines the hidden cost of trauma at work. And this isn't confined to one industry. Studies show the same patterns in finance, healthcare, education, and technology alike. No matter the job description, unresolved stress echoes through concentration, memory, communication, and collaboration in predictable ways. The context may change, but the nervous system does not discriminate between a childhood household and a corporate office when deciding how to stay safe. It's important to balance this picture. Workplace performance has many contributors: sleep quality, nutrition, ADHD, depression, physical health, and organizational culture all play roles. Recognizing the impact of early adversity doesn't exclude these factors. It adds another critical piece to the puzzle that often remains overlooked in productivity discussions. When seen together, the patterns form a clear message. Struggles at work often reflect survival strategies that once made sense but now quietly sabotage output. Unacknowledged, they reinforce shame and burnout. Acknowledged, they open the door to healthier ways of working. And sometimes what looks like a person simply being too slow or too hesitant is actually something more particular, a perfectionist loop, where safety feels tied to doing every task flawlessly. That loop deserves its own attention, because it doesn't just drain hours, it disguises itself as hard work. Perfectionism, the Polish prison. Picture this. You open an email draft, type a few lines, then spend nearly an hour rearranging words, adjusting punctuation, and rereading until you can barely tell what you wrote in the first place. By the time you finally send it, you're exhausted and behind on everything else. That fatigue doesn't come from grammar, it comes from perfectionism, the polished prison that holds so many workers captive without them even realizing it. Perfectionism gets mistaken for ambition, but what drives it is rarely pure confidence. For many, the roots lie in childhood, where approval felt tied to flawless performance. A child who sensed that mistakes came with rejection or withdrawal of affection often grew up with a hidden rule: never make an error. That rule, designed to protect early connection, follows them into adulthood and reshapes how even the simplest tasks feel. This doesn't mean every form of perfectionism is destructive. Some is adaptive, helping people set high but realistic goals. The version that slows work to a crawl is different, fed not by striving toward growth, but by fearing criticism. The irony is clear. Perfectionism does not actually raise standards, it delays outcomes. What seems like careful preparation is often an anxious cycle of polishing and correcting that steals time from other tasks. Teams stall because one person can't let go of their contribution, and deadlines slip while drafts get endlessly reworked. Productivity on the surface disguises real inefficiency underneath. Science offers a sharp window into why this happens. Perfectionism often reflects an overactive threat response. When mistakes were once associated with danger, the nervous system treats ordinary work as high stakes. Studies show early stress can reduce top-down regulation from the prefrontal cortex over the amygdala. This shift makes small errors feel like outsized threats, which helps explain why perfectionists feel driven to correct endlessly rather than move forward. What looks rational to them, triple-checking every word, is actually their brain rehearsing safety routines. And over time, that protective loop comes at a heavy emotional cost. Hours disappear into details that matter far less than the energy poured into them. Instead of peace and finishing, there's anxiety that something still isn't good enough. The person appears hardworking but goes home drained, still replaying the email they sent or the typo they fear they missed. The polished result is real, but the toll hidden beneath it is just as real. Breaking this cycle takes more than generic advice about letting things go. One practical experiment is what some therapists call a finish and send rule. Cap routine tasks like emails at 10 minutes with a visible timer. When the time ends, send, even if it feels risky. The point isn't to lower standards, but to retrain the nervous system to tolerate imperfection in safe, low-stakes ways. Over repetition, the brain learns that nothing catastrophic happens when good enough replaces flawless. Perfectionism can feel isolating because it masquerades as diligence. But once we recognize it for what it is, a survival strategy carried into adult work, the bind becomes clearer. The link between effort and progress is severed. More tinkering doesn't equal more output. Which raises the next question. If tightening the grip slows you down, what happens when the grip slips entirely and effort gets redirected into avoidance instead? Procrastination. Waiting for trouble. Why does the urge to reorganize a bookshelf strike exactly when a deadline is breathing down your neck? Why does folding laundry suddenly feel urgent while a major report sits untouched? Most people laugh at these moments of procrastination, but beneath the humor lies a more serious truth. Choosing low-stakes work over high-stakes tasks often comes from the body trying to manage stress. In many cases, procrastination is not a quirk of personality, but a nervous system strategy. When a task carries the possibility of judgment, the body can interpret it as a threat. The heart rate quickens, muscles tense, and the urge to escape builds. Avoidance offers quick relief. Sweeping the floor feels safe, responding to texts feels manageable, but the bigger task grows heavier in the background. Research summarized by McLean Hospital describes this as a cycle of trigger, stress interpretation, avoidance. The task triggers stress, the body interprets it as danger, avoidance provides temporary relief, and stress increases later when the deadline looms closer. What looks irrational in the present actually makes perfect sense when understood as the body protecting itself. Childhood experiences can heighten this loop. In unpredictable or highly critical households, mistakes often brought punishment, shame, or loss of affection. A child in that environment quickly developed a radar for errors, learning that the safest course was delay or silence. As adults, tasks with evaluation, writing, presenting, submitting work, awaken that same radar. Procrastination becomes a shield against the sting of possible rejection. In this sense, many episodes of delay are echoes from earlier conditioning. Still, trauma isn't the whole story. Procrastination often overlaps with anxiety, ADHD, and low self-efficacy. Trauma is one important pathway, but not the only one. For some people, constant internal pressure leads to avoidance. For others, distractibility or difficulty with task initiation creates the same outcome. What unites the experiences is the attempt to sidestep discomfort, even at the expense of long-term stress. The frustration increases because common solutions, time-blocking apps, accountability, partners, elaborate schedules, often fail to solve it. These tools provide structure, but structure doesn't calm a nervous system bracing for threat. Simply telling yourself to just start rarely works when your body reacts as though the assignment is a predator. Neurobiology shows why. Stress circuits in the brain can overwhelm planning regions, cutting off the smooth transition from intention to action. In other words, you can write a perfect to-do list and still find yourself watching videos or washing dishes if your brain tags the task itself as dangerous. Camouflage makes procrastination even trickier. The person delaying their most important project rarely lies idle. Instead, they chase minor wins, replying to routine emails, reorganizing files, completing administrative tasks. Each small action brings a hit of brain reward chemistry, reinforcing the illusion of productivity. But because energy goes to lower value work, the central project remains untouched and heavier with each passing hour. That imbalance is what creates the sense of exhaustion even after a busy day. Soon, guilt and self-criticism pile on. The worker who has spent hours avoiding starts to think, "I've already wasted too much time," which pushes the task further out of reach. Shame about not starting becomes an additional barrier to beginning. Psychologists describe this as a feedback loop. The task feels threatening, avoidance lowers the threat temporarily, guilt reinforces anxiety, and then avoidance repeats. It is not a question of laziness. It is an outdated protective routine colliding with adult responsibilities. When understood through the survival lens, the pattern makes sense. Avoidance once protected children from explosive environments by keeping them invisible. As adults, the same reflex kicks in against deadlines and presentations, even though the context has changed. The nervous system doesn't distinguish between a parent's unpredictable anger and a manager's simple request. It reacts to both as potential danger. This perspective changes the narrative. Rather than blaming procrastination on weak willpower or poor discipline, it can be reframed as the body's attempt to keep the person safe. A survival system cannot be scolded into compliance. It seeks reassurance, not commands. That is why so many workers repeat the cycle despite endless time management tools. The underlying physiology is left unaddressed. A more compassionate approach starts with naming the pattern. Recognizing procrastination as a stress loop helps reduce shame, because it clarifies that the choice to avoid is not simply self-sabotage. From there, experiments in breaking the cycle become possible. One evidence-aligned strategy is the 15-minute start rule. Instead of committing to finishing the entire task, the goal is to work for just 15 minutes with a visible timer. The brain perceives that chunk as manageable, which lowers the initial threat response. After the timer ends, you can stop or continue, but more often than not, getting started dissolves the paralysis. Repetition trains the nervous system to associate work with tolerable levels of risk rather than overwhelming danger. This is not a cure, but a small shift in approach. By breaking down tasks and lowering the entry threshold, the loop can be softened over time. The effectiveness lies less in what gets accomplished in 15 minutes than in proving to yourself that the work is survivable. Relief then comes not only from avoidance but from completion too, which teaches the brain new associations. Framed this way, procrastination becomes less a personal flaw and more a signal of what the body is still protecting. Household chores, binge watching, excessive tidying, these diversions are all part of the same effort to stay safe. Understanding replaces blame with curiosity. What is my nervous system trying to shield me from right now? That single question helps loosen the grip of shame and opens the door to starting, even in small steps. Of course, procrastination is only one way that old survival strategies show up at work. Sometimes the body doesn't push us away from tasks but pulls us toward others, especially when those others belong to the people around us. And that is another kind of detour, one that feels like being helpful but often leaves our own responsibilities unfinished. People-pleasing, the productivity trap. You're sitting at your desk, The deadline for your own project is closing in, and just as you're trying to concentrate, a coworker leans over. "Hey, could you help me with this real quick?" Before your brain catches up, the word yes is already out. You know your own schedule is packed, but the reflex to agree feels easier than pausing, explaining, or worse, risking disapproval. By the time their issue is solved, hours are gone and your own work is untouched. That reflex has served you before, but now it costs you time, and with it, energy you never meant to part with. This pattern often grows from early learning. In households where affection or stability depended on pleasing a parent, many children adapted by monitoring moods, smoothing conflicts, and suppressing their own needs. Approval became conditional, and attention was tied to compliance. Researchers point to insecure attachment as one of the roots of this behavior. When safety felt uncertain, aligning with the needs of others ensured protection. The child survived by anticipating, accommodating, and yielding. That adaptive rule, "I'll be safe if I don't upset anyone," doesn't vanish with age. It moves into the workplace, where automatic agreement feels like the safest course long after the danger is gone. At the surface, offices reward people-pleasing. Colleagues praise the person who always jumps in, managers call them reliable, and teams lean on their eagerness. But beneath those compliments lies a cost. The hours spent rescuing others are subtracted from personal projects. The consistent yes keeps relationships smooth, but erodes focus. What looked like strength early in a career can harden into a pattern where progress on one's own goals stalls while energy is distributed elsewhere. The real cost is twofold. First, people-pleasing steals attention and time. Each act of helping seems small. A quick favor, a short meeting dodged into your calendar, but the interruptions break the continuity of your own projects. Deep work requires immersion, and every shift toward another's urgency creates fragments that grow harder to stitch back together. At scale, entire weeks shrink under these micro-diversions of effort. Second, the health toll runs quietly in the background. Compliance may calm a tense moment socially, but it sends the body into repeated cycles of vigilance, scanning for cues, bracing for criticism, working ahead of others' reactions. Over time, this near-constant stress chips away at sleep, immune balance, focus, and energy. Large-scale studies show that adults with histories of early stress and conditional environments carry higher risk for chronic health issues, ranging from fatigue and disrupted sleep to cardiovascular strain. What looks like dedication at work is often a nervous system caught in alert mode, spending reserves faster than they can be restored. The difficulty of saying no is not about logic, it's about physiology. A coworker's frown or hesitation can echo the same tension an adult once felt with a volatile parent. The body reacts as though approval is oxygen and scarcity is suffocation. The yes comes fast because it soothes the anxious spike before it grows. Productivity slips not because of lack of skill or effort, but because the nervous system prioritizes safety over efficiency. The reward, a smile, thanks, or nod of recognition, brings short relief. But the long-term effect is trade-offs that remain invisible until deadlines slip and energy collapses. The problem isn't generosity itself. Helping others is a healthy part of human connection. The problem is when the scale tips so far toward others' needs that personal boundaries vanish. In the office, this can mean being the go-to person for extra assignments, absorbing unresolved work from peers, or protecting managers from their own oversights. Each yes reinforces the habit, while each missed personal deadline reinforces shame. The cycle sustains itself. The more approval slips away, the more the reflex chases it through compliance. Breaking this loop starts with permission to experiment. One shift, safe and practical, is choosing a single small no in the week ahead. Decline a non-essential meeting, reschedule a favor for a later day, or pause before automatically agreeing. The goal isn't rejection or defiance. It's retraining the body to discover that saying no does not equal catastrophe. Over time, those experiments help the nervous system build a new pattern. Boundaries can exist without relationships collapsing. Safety no longer has to come only through agreement. What's emphasized here is compassion, not blame. These patterns exist because they worked once. They maintain stability in environments that felt fragile, and for that, they should be recognized as clever survival. But survival rules are not always suited for adult workloads. The focus is not about judging yourself for each yes, but about noticing when your time no longer belongs to you. Productivity depends on more than hours. It depends on having the courage, little by little, to direct those hours where they matter most. And if the person doesn't pause, the costs show up everywhere. In locked calendars filled with other people's obligations, in projects left undone, in the exhaustion of juggling tasks that don't belong to you. The effect is subtle but accumulative. More effort goes out, less progress comes back in. Invisible demands become visible exhaustion. What started as self-protection now erodes both well-being and results. Seen this way, people-pleasing isn't generosity distorted into weakness. It's an earlier defense that never got the chance to evolve. Naming it removes its secrecy. Practicing small boundaries introduces new evidence to the body that disapproval can be tolerated and connection can still stand. Each revision of the pattern gives back not only lost time, but a steadier baseline of health that supporting others cannot deplete as quickly. But when that recognition doesn't come, the costs accumulate. Each unexamined yes pulls hours away, each strained night's sleep adds fatigue, and each unpaid debt to your own work grows larger. Eventually, no amount of rearranging your calendar can cover the fact that the body itself is losing pace. The steady drain of pleasing at the expense of rest, focus, and recovery leads towards something heavier than unfinished projects. A system that simply can't keep running on borrowed energy. And it is here, when the body begins to insist on limits, that the next stage often arrives. Burnout, the body says no. Picture an office in the late evening. Fluorescent lights hum, screens glow, and an employee leans forward, clutching a third cup of coffee as though it will hold them upright. Their shoulders slump, vision blurs, and every muscle drags with fatigue. Still, their mind pushes the command. Just one more email, just one more slide. What looks like devotion from the outside is something very different on the inside. This is not resilience. It is burnout, the body refusing to keep up with demands long after energy has been drained. Burnout is often mistaken for willpower collapsed under workload, but it is more accurately a survival pattern repeating itself. For many who grew up in unpredictable households, vigilance was safety. As children, they monitored every gesture or shift in tone, believing constant alertness could prevent conflict. That attitude etched itself into the nervous system, teaching the body that lowering its guard was dangerous. In workplaces, the same wiring replays itself. Instead of slammed doors at home, it's inbox alerts and deadlines. The nervous system drives someone forward, refusing pause, even when rest is what the body needs most. Days stretch long, sleep contracts, caffeine fills the gaps, until the very system keeping them strong becomes the source of breakdown. Burnout doesn't arrive overnight. It accumulates across thousands of moments where tension signals are ignored. It shows up in small knots in the stomach on weekday mornings, in headaches dismissed at the desk, and in the slow thinning of patience with colleagues or friends. When people carry a nervous system already burdened by early vigilance, their margins are slimmer. Where others might dip into rest, they keep grinding forward, believing anything less risks failure or rejection. What they call persistence is really deterioration, masked by a culture that mistakes exhaustion for dedication. Scientific research deepens this picture. Studies consistently show that adults who experience childhood adversity report higher rates of chronic fatigue and workplace stress. Biological patterns make the reasons clear. Instead of resetting fully after daily challenges, their stress hormone cycles stay elevated, leaving the body half stuck in alert mode. Over months and years, this accelerates wear and tear. Higher inflammation, disrupted immune regulation, and increased risk for chronic illness are all associated with repeated early adversity. In fact, population data shows that people with multiple adverse childhood experiences face a higher risk of chronic disease and even measurable reductions in life expectancy. The idea that burnout is just in your head collapses under evidence that the body itself is reshaped by long-term vigilance. Despite this, modern culture glamorizes burnout, turning it into a strange badge of honor. Staying late, working through weekends, or replying to emails at midnight are often celebrated as proof of loyalty or grit. Yet beneath every compliment is the same unacknowledged cost. When survival patterns drive performance, overextension becomes inevitable. What begins as an extra hour in the evening soon hardens into a lifestyle. The brain interprets every unwillingness to stop as prevention of loss, when in fact it is the trigger for accumulated harm. Systems wear down not because effort failed, but because the body was trained never to switch off. The consequences stretch wide. Fatigue muddies attention. Decision-making slows. Irritability seeps into conversations both at work and at home. Productivity falls, which ironically pressures the person to work harder, deepening exhaustion while output declines. This looping decline is not laziness. It is the nervous system straining against limits it learned to ignore. The ripple effects reach beyond the individual. In offices where exhaustion dominates, mistakes grow, efficiency drops, and turnover rises as bodies and minds can no longer carry the load. What workplaces frame as strength hides a fragile foundation eroded from beneath. Another quiet marker of burnout is found not in work itself, but in rest. Some employees describe the inability to relax, even with time carved out for recovery. Vacations become restless rehearsals of unfinished tasks. Weekends fill with anxiety about emails. Nights meant for sleep stretch into racing thoughts of deadlines and criticism. This difficulty stopping is the most direct evidence that vigilance has become default. The nervous system misreads stillness as risk, so the body stays braced even when conditions are safe. Recovery offers insight here. It is neither fast nor simple, yet it is possible. When the system has been overcharged for years, balance cannot be restored with a single weekend away. But small, steady practices can begin to update the body's script. Recovery is not about absence of demands. It is about teaching the nervous system that calm is survivable. Research on stress regulation emphasizes that consistent micro-rest patterns restore balance over time. Recovery can be slow, requiring daily effort, but it does not demand collapse beforehand. A practical starting point is what some therapists describe as a mini rest ritual. Rather than waiting for burnout to force retreat, create a predictable, non-negotiable pause in each day, even just 5 minutes. Paced breathing in a quiet space, a short walk outside, or a brief stretch away from devices all signal the body that safety can exist in stillness. Predictability matters. By repeating the same pause at a similar time, the nervous system gradually learns to trust rhythm over constant alertness. These micro-practices do not erase deep exhaustion overnight, but they carve the first pathways back from survival-driven overwork. Seen this way, burnout is no longer a story of weak resilience, but of outdated survival strategies applied to modern demands. The fatigue, the fog, the irritability, these are not failings of character, but signs of a system stretched by signals it was never taught to reinterpret. The expression holds. Burnout is the body saying no when the mind refuses to recognize the need. That refusal comes not just from personal drive, but from years of conditioning, where rest once carried risk. And while the breakdowns of energy and health capture attention, they are only part of the picture. Burnout affects more than the body, it reshapes thought itself. The same patterns that force people to keep working also interfere with how the brain directs attention and decision-making. When stress becomes the atmosphere, concentration splinters, memory falters, and the ability to think clearly suffers. In workplaces, this often looks like distraction or failure to keep up. But the root is deeper, the nervous system replaying survival modes from long ago. It is here that the costs of trauma emerge most clearly in how the brain handles focus. That is the next piece of the story, how trauma hijacks brain focus. What often gets labeled as distraction starts much earlier in the brain. Focus is not simply about resisting phones or social media. It is about whether the brain's attention systems grew up in an environment of safety or survival. When safety was uncertain in childhood, the wiring that later supports concentration was shaped to scan for danger instead of settling on tasks. What looks like a wandering mind in adulthood is often that old survival system still trying to run the show. A key piece sits in how the brain matures. The prefrontal cortex, which supports planning, decision-making, and sustained attention, develops slowly across childhood and adolescence. It is meant to become the conductor, balancing impulses and keeping the alarm system in check. But under repeated stress, the body reroutes resources. The amygdala, the brain's watchtower, grows louder while the prefrontal cortex quiets. Neuroscience reviews confirm that early stress alters the connectivity between these two regions, helping explain why the alarm often hijacks focus years later. For the child, this adaptation made sense. It kept them alert for conflict. For the adult, it makes work tasks feel oddly threatening. The result shows up in small, ordinary ways. Writing a single email triggers a rush of tension. Sitting down with a report sparks an urge to walk away. Decision-making feels heavier than it should. These aren't failures of willpower, but logical outcomes of a nervous system tuned to danger. The brain did exactly what it learned to do early: keep scanning for risk, even when the current task only carries ordinary pressure. Focus fragments, not because the person is careless, but because the alarm system keeps interrupting the conductor's rhythm. One practical way to interrupt this alarm is through what psychologists call a micropractice. Even 60 seconds of pausing, closing the eyes, and scanning the body or slowing the breath can quiet the nervous system enough for the prefrontal cortex to regain influence. This isn't about relaxation in the abstract. It's a way to tell the brain that the present task is not a threat. Done at predictable moments, like before opening a difficult document or tackling an intimidating call, these rituals redirect attention by lowering the volume on the alarm before it takes over. The hope lies in plasticity. Although early stress leaves marks, the brain does not stay fixed. New routines and safe repetitions carve fresh pathways. When small, predictable signals of safety repeat over and over, the prefrontal cortex strengthens its role again. In everyday terms, this might look like building short daily rituals, walking without a phone during your break, keeping a consistent shutting down routine at the end of the day, or taking 3 breaths every time a new task starts. Each act is brief, but together they retrain the system, showing it over time that concentration is survivable. This doesn't minimize the difficulty. The wiring for vigilance was laid down over years, so it doesn't vanish with a few practices. But every pause that quiets the alarm adds another layer of evidence to the nervous system. Just as early stress built one pathway, repetition in calmer conditions builds a new one. The outdated operating system can be updated. The brain may always carry traces of vigilance, but it can also learn to prioritize focus when the world around it no longer requires constant scanning. Understanding this mechanism changes how people view their own struggles. Instead of blaming themselves for short attention or scattered thoughts, they can start to recognize an old system replaying itself. The question shifts from, "Why can't I focus?" to "What does my nervous system still think it needs to protect me from?" That shift alone can reduce shame, leaving room for practical choices about how to build new regulation. It allows focus to feel like something that can be trained, not something irreversibly damaged. The reframing also helps inside workplaces. Managers and colleagues often assume distraction is about effort. Recognizing that for many, focus is not blocked by laziness, but hijacked by an overactive alarm system makes support possible. Encouraging breaks, normalizing short pauses before stressful tasks, and promoting predictable routines within teams doesn't just improve productivity. It gives employees a real chance to reclaim focus from systems the office cannot see. What matters most is agency. If a nervous system can learn to stay on guard, it can also learn to let go. The path forward is less about forcing attention with willpower and more about retraining physiology with safe, repeatable steps. Every body scan, every short breathing pause, every small moment of predictable rest is a signal to the brain. This task is not dangerous. Over time, focus grows not through pushing harder, but through a nervous system convinced it no longer needs to leave the room. And once that becomes visible, the next step is noticing these patterns when they arise. The fatigue, the fractured concentration, the restless avoidance, these aren't random. They are signals that a script written long ago is playing out again. The challenge and the opportunity now lie in recognizing those scripts as they surface, so they no longer run quietly beneath the day. Awareness. Spotting the silent scripts. If you've ever slammed your laptop shut when the Wi-Fi disconnected and caught yourself fuming far more than the situation deserved, that reaction probably wasn't about the internet at all. What showed up in that moment was a script written much earlier, when unpredictability carried weight far heavier than a video freeze. This is where awareness begins. recognizing that the charge in your reaction isn't always tied to the present. Awareness isn't flashy. It doesn't give the instant thrill of crossing a task off your list, but it is the foundation for spotting when old survival strategies have slipped into your workday. Most people stay locked onto the tasks themselves, emails, calls, late-night edits, without asking why those tasks feel so urgent, so exhausting, or so impossible. Awareness directs the light away from the checklist and toward the patterns underneath. It says, pause long enough to see not just what you're doing, but how you're doing it. That shift provides the ground for change. You don't need complicated systems to do this. Awareness rests on 3 repeatable steps: notice, note, pause. Notice means identifying when your body begins to tighten, shoulders rising, chest heavy, stomach pulling down. Note means jotting a quick line that marks the pattern, ideally in a 2 or 3 minute end-of-day check rather than an hour-long session you'll abandon by week 2. Pause means giving yourself a 30-second breath break. No agenda except to slow your system. Notice, note, pause. The rhythm itself becomes the practice. Let's take procrastination as an example. Someone stares at a blank slide, but instead of jumping in, they shift to scrolling on their phone. Awareness doesn't mean scolding yourself for putting it off. It means first noticing that your jaw tightened while the cursor blinked back at you. Then it means jotting down at the day's end, slide deck, tension in jaw, scrolled. Finally, when the urge arises again, layering in that 30-second pause, eyes closed, one steady cycle of breath. By repeating small experiments, you shift from drowning in the loop to observing its structure. That is the foundation of choice. Perfectionism offers another case. Suppose you spent an hour polishing a sentence that no one but you would care about. Awareness starts by catching the rising urge to over-edit, shoulders stiff, eyes straining, heartbeat quickening. Noticing turns discomfort into signal rather than shame. At the close of the day, you make a quick note. Supervisor feedback days, over-edit script appears. Over time, patterns emerge as clearly as if you were mapping them on paper. Then, when you feel the grip begin tightening at your desk, you fold in the 30-second pause. The nervous system learns that stopping briefly doesn't invite catastrophe. It interrupts the old demand for perfection. People-pleasing ties into this as well. You catch yourself saying yes automatically when your plate is already full. Instead of turning the event into an indictment of your discipline, awareness shifts it back into pattern recognition. Notice chest tight, quickened breath the moment someone asked for help. Note, overworked day, still said yes. Pause, 30 seconds before answering next time. Even if the answer stays yes, slowing long enough to name the sensation begins rewriting the loop. The reflex loses some of its invisibility. Journaling plays an important role here, but only if it stays small enough to repeat every day. A brief nightly pattern check of 2 or 3 minutes is powerful, precisely because it can be sustained. You aren't cataloging your history, you're marking repetitions. Scribbled fragments like avoidance when tired, overwork when unacknowledged, or yes during overwhelm add up into trend lines the nervous system can't deny. Journaling becomes less about memory and more about anchoring awareness in practice. Research consistently shows that short, consistent routines are far more effective for long-term change than ambitious but unsustainable efforts. Humor has value too. Laughing lightly at your old scripts keeps defensiveness from taking over. A simple thought, I didn't just yell at the Wi-Fi, I yelled at my childhood rulebook, reduces the heaviness and allows curiosity to rise. Used sparingly, humor turns awareness from a burden into something easier to carry. It doesn't replace the noticing, noting, and pausing, but it makes the whole process easier to live with. Why does this matter for productivity? Because until the scripts are visible, they run unhindered. Without awareness, a lost hour turns into guilt, which becomes 2 more lost hours. A sudden collapse into burnout feels like a personal failing, rather than an outcome of repeated ignored signals. With awareness, the sequence becomes apparent. Tension before avoidance, strain before collapse, compliance before resentment. That clarity does not erase the pattern immediately, but it breaks the illusion that the pattern is who you are. Instead of identity, you are observing process. The benefit compounds. Once you notice and name a trigger often enough, you can plan around it. If you know that heavy tasks consistently trigger avoidance, you can place a micro break before opening them. If you spot that your yes reflex spikes at 3 p.m. when you're low on energy, you can build an evening routine around recovery instead of resentment. Awareness is like outlining hazards on a map. You still walk the terrain, but you stop being surprised by the traps you already know exist. This practice interrupts shame most of all. Without awareness, each stall or overextension feels personal. You call yourself lazy, weak, broken. That story deepens stress, feeding the very loops you're trying to escape. With awareness, you might instead say, "This was my system protecting me again." That simple shift lightens the moment, which leaves just enough room to try again differently. Compassion becomes a byproduct of awareness, not an added demand. And compassion makes the loop easier to soften next time. In practical application, awareness does not demand hours or retreats. The most effective experiments are short. A 60 to 90-second check-in once in the morning and again midday, breath slowed, posture noticed, one thought gently acknowledged, carries more impact than a 1-hour practice you will never sustain. The point is not depth of reflection, but consistency of interruption. Each repetition convinces the nervous system that other choices exist besides the old automatic script. Using this structure, your day begins to shift in texture. You may still feel the surge to overwork, but you catch it earlier. You still dread the report, but pausing makes starting manageable. You still want to say yes, but you're able to wait 15 seconds before responding. None of these micro wins is dramatic, but together they form the lived proof that survival rules can be updated. Productivity becomes less about pushing and more about pacing, guided by a system that recognizes safety where it once imagined danger. Awareness, then, is not a cure. It is a tool you can experiment with daily, in seconds, without rearranging your entire life. Notice the signal, note the pattern, pause the loop. Over time, the small choices accumulate into trust, the kind your nervous system didn't get to build when it needed it most. And through that trust, you create the conditions where other approaches and tools can finally gain traction. Which brings us to a deeper question. If awareness changes the way we meet our stress patterns, why do so many well-known productivity methods still fail to stick for countless people? The answer leads toward the next step. Not just tracking the scripts, but pairing that awareness with routines that directly support healing. Rewiring work habits through healing. Why do some tools seem effortless for one person but impossible for another? Take the Pomodoro timer. For some, breaking work into 25-minute sprints feels refreshing. For others, the timer rings, and nothing changes. The difference is not discipline alone. It's the state of the nervous system. Routines struggle when the system is chronically reactive. Without regulation, the best tools collapse under the weight of old stress signals. This is why so many people feel defeated by their own attempts at productivity. They try digital planners, time-blocking schedules, or accountability check-ins. Each system works only as long as stress levels stay low. But when the body reads ordinary pressure as threat, the habit unravels. Instead of proving undisciplined, they are colliding with reflexes wired for survival. That cycle breeds shame. People think they failed the system when in reality, the system wasn't designed for a body on constant alert. Healing shifts the foundation. Productivity tools assume you start at neutral, but trauma lowers the threshold. Instead of imposing tools over an unsettled baseline, effective habits begin by regulating the system first. Research highlights several practices that reliably calm reactivity: slowed breathing, brief pauses outdoors, mindful scans of the body, and gentle movement breaks. Each practice restores balance to stress circuits, which makes it possible for tools to hold. Regulation doesn't erase pressure, but it lowers the false alarms that derail consistency. One example shows how this pairing works. Imagine using a Pomodoro timer, as usual, 25 minutes on, a short pause after. But rather than treating that pause as idle time, fold in a grounding ritual. In that 90-second break, slow your breath or focus on a neutral body sensation. Instead of returning restless, the nervous system takes the cue that work and safety can coexist. Over repeated cycles, the body learns that stopping is survivable, and the tool now cooperates with biology rather than fighting it. Without that kind of healing practice, rest can feel unsafe. Many who grew up in volatile households learned that pausing risked punishment or rejection. As adults, they work through fatigue, not because they want to, but because their body confuses rest with danger. A timer telling them to stop only invites guilt. Reframing rest as part of safety training changes this script. Each planned break becomes not indulgence but conditioning, a deliberate rehearsal that nothing bad follows a pause. Slowly, the nervous system rewires, letting tools like timers become allies. Boundaries follow the same principle. A calendar will block time, but if the reflex to overcommit remains, the space fills with others' demands. Trauma often conditioned children to protect attachment by saying yes. That script can flatten even the strictest productivity plan. Healing begins with small refusals, a short no to a non-essential request, until the body learns disapproval does not equal danger. Once established, these safety no's transform the ordinary calendar. Boundaries stop being a fragile wish and start becoming part of embodied practice. Embodied breaks add a further layer. Stress is stored in muscle and breath just as much as thought. Shoulders tense, posture locks, breath shortens. Ignoring these signals keeps the system braced. Short physical resets, a stretch, a slow walk, or simply lengthening the exhale, pull the body out of vigilance. Used at regular intervals, they reduce baseline arousal, which stabilizes focus and supports more structured work blocks. These aren't luxuries, they are maintenance that keeps strategies functional over time. This perspective corrects a common misunderstanding. Popular methods promise results if you stack your habits with more willpower. Trauma survivors often fall hardest for that promise, only to watch the cycle of effort and collapse repeat. A trauma-informed lens changes the sequence. First, regulate the system, then apply the tool. Otherwise, strategies coat an unstable surface. With regulation in place, ordinary tools stop slipping and start building. That shift also reduces shame. Instead of asking, why do I break every system, the question becomes, what part of me resists this tool and why? A missed planner entry stops being proof of laziness, it becomes feedback about safety. Curiosity replaces guilt. By experimenting with how to make tools survivable, people recover agency. Tools stop being rigid demands and start turning into flexible supports. Even small adjustments reflect this. Say you want to write daily. Instead of pushing for 2 uninterrupted hours, begin with a short block paired with grounding. 15 minutes of writing, 90 seconds of slow breathing before and after. The work gets done without triggering overwhelm. As tolerance grows, the time expands. What makes the practice sustainable is not the rigidity of the timer, but the safety built in around it. The nervous system learns gradually that structure is not a threat. Seen clearly, tools are amplifiers, not solutions. If safety underlies the routine, a timer or checklist amplifies momentum. If threat underlies it, the same timer amplifies avoidance or overwork. Healing directs which way the scale tips. That's why years of searching for the perfect method often fail. The missing piece isn't format, it's foundation. Establish safety first, and almost any tool will gain staying power. Reframing productivity this way makes every daily action part of healing. Rest is no longer wasted time, it's nervous system calibration. Boundaries aren't selfish refusals, they are long-term safeguards. Tiny breathing practices are not decorative wellness, they are structural supports for focus. Once those anchors are set, tools layer in smoothly, doing what they were designed to do instead of fighting old scripts. The larger point is simple but often overlooked. Strategy only lasts if the system feels safe. That's why hacks fade for so many people. They force behaviors on top of doubt and vigilance. But when regulation combines with structure, consistency follows naturally. The tools become sustainable, not because of extra willpower, but because the nervous system believes it can stop bracing. For anyone hearing this, one quick test makes the idea concrete. Pick one task you've been avoiding. Instead of scheduling an hour, block only 10 minutes. Before starting, pause for 90 seconds of calm. Slow your breath, let your shoulders drop. Then, after the 10 minutes, close with the same short ritual. That small bracket teaches the body 2 things: that work can happen inside safety, and that structure doesn't equal threat. Repeat it once a day for a week and see whether concentration shifts. It is not a cure, but a living experiment. These simple integrations point to a larger framework. Productivity by itself can't resolve old scripts. But healing joined with structure can. As that balance takes shape, the individual moves from fighting each system to letting systems finally work. And once the separate parts, awareness, boundaries, regulation, and structured tools begin to align, a very different picture of sustainable focus starts to emerge. The framework from survival mode to sustainable focus. When progress in work finally feels steady instead of fragile, the reason is rarely a new app or planner. It usually comes from changing the way the body responds to stress. That is the purpose of this next step, a framework for moving from survival mode into sustainable focus. It's built on 4 parts: awareness, boundaries, healing rituals, and productivity systems. Each is simple enough to try immediately, but together they form the base that keeps focus steady instead of fleeting. The first step is awareness. Without noticing what's happening in the body, nothing else holds. Awareness means catching the moment you tense up before a deadline or lose yourself in overwork, and seeing it for what it is, a script running the show. A micro-practice makes this concrete. Take 2 minutes at the end of each workday to jot down one moment where focus slipped or pressure spiked. One line only. Over time, these notes reveal patterns that aren't random mistakes, but predictable responses. The act of naming them is what makes them visible, and visibility is where control begins. The second step is boundaries. Awareness shows the pattern. But without boundaries, the pattern keeps running. Boundaries aren't about hard rules for others. They're cues for your nervous system that overextension is no longer required for safety. A simple starting point is one small no this week. Decline a non-essential meeting, silence notifications after hours, or reschedule a favor for another day. Each small refusal retrains the body to believe it is safe, even when you don't over-accommodate. The practice is less about the size of the no, and more about teaching the nervous system that saying it will not break connection or cause harm. Next is healing rituals. These are what most people skip, but they hold the system together. Healing rituals counter the physiological residue of survival mode. Without them, awareness and boundaries remain fragile. The goal is not long retreats or perfect meditation routines. It's brief signals of safety, repeated each day. Choose one: 3 to 5 minutes of slow breathing with longer exhales, a short walk outside without devices, or gentle stretching between meetings. These micro-rituals reduce baseline stress and keep the nervous system from staying locked in overdrive. They tell the body again and again that pausing is safe. Consistency matters far more than duration. Finally come productivity systems. Tools like Pomodoro timers, calendars, or task apps work best once the nervous system is calmer. The difference is dramatic. A timer, reminding you to stop, no longer triggers guilt because rituals have already taught the body that rest is survivable. A blocked calendar no longer collapses under constant interruptions because boundaries are in place to protect time. A practical way to combine the two is this. Use a Pomodoro timer for a 25-minute focus block, and in the 5-minute break, insert 90 seconds of grounding breath. This pairing turns the tool into more than a schedule. It becomes a reinforcement of safety alongside work. That is what allows routines to stick across weeks instead of falling apart after a few days. These 4 parts form a chain, each stabilizing the one after it. Skip the early steps and systems collapse under stress. Move through them in sequence, and productivity changes from brittle effort into something sustainable. The framework is not about rigid rules, but about laying conditions where focus emerges naturally. And the science offers reassurance here. Brains are plastic. Small, repeated safety signals change wiring over time. That is why 2 minutes of awareness, 1 small no, 3 minutes of breathing, and short focus blocks add up. They are not cosmetic fixes, but repeated opportunities for the nervous system to update its assumptions. If you look at the bigger picture, the framework frees attention that was once chained to survival. Awareness prevents autopilot. Boundaries stop the endless leaking of time into other people's urgency. Rituals calm the physiology that drives burnout. Systems finally create structure rather than shame. When combined, the effect is less strain and more stability. Instead of waiting until collapse forces change, these steps let the body find balance before exhaustion arrives. Work steadies because the nervous system steadies. It is worth naming what this does for everyday struggles. Procrastination becomes easier to interrupt when you know to note the moment and take one grounding breath. Perfectionism softens when boundaries remind you that not every comma is worth an hour. People-pleasing loosens when you discover one polite no will not ruin connection. Burnout retreats when rituals restore small cycles of rest across the day. The process isn't dramatic in the moment, but the accumulation reshapes a week, a month, eventually a career. The value is not in perfection, but in repetition. Each day you will miss steps, forgetting to note, skipping a ritual, slipping into saying yes. The framework is not defeated by this, it expects it. Progress comes from returning to the chain the next time, because every repetition adds weight to the new pathway. This is how rewiring works, not by one decisive change, but by consistent signals. Safety grows by small degrees each time the body learns that pausing, saying no, or resting does not bring danger. And it is here that the framework resolves the question so many workers carry. They wonder why they fall behind despite all the apps and calendars. They assume more discipline is the answer. The framework flips that logic. Structure succeeds when the system beneath it is calm. You don't need to push harder. You need conditions where focus doesn't have to fight the past. In that space, productivity stops feeling like survival and starts resembling presence, showing up fully for the work in front of you without draining yourself dry. The shift is subtle but powerful. Deadlines stop feeling like silent threats. Meetings turn back into conversations instead of battles for approval. Tasks become tasks again, no longer tangled in the echoes of old fears. This is sustainable focus, not in the sense of forcing longevity, but in the sense of being held by a body that no longer interprets daily work as crisis. That is the real payoff of the framework. But while this approach transforms personal productivity, something else fuels the challenge from outside. Many workplaces still celebrate overextension, confusing collapsed nervous systems with strong work ethic. The culture often honors the person who sacrifices rest even when their body is the one carrying hidden costs. And it is here that individual change meets the larger story shaping how we all work. The cultural myth of hustle. Step into any late-night office and you'll see rows of glowing screens, tired faces, and coffee cups gone cold. In many workplaces, this scene is quietly celebrated. The person who stays longer, answers emails at midnight, or skips dinner with family is often seen as the most dedicated. This is the cultural myth of hustle, the belief that exhaustion signals worth, and that working yourself past healthy limits proves loyalty and ambition. Yet beneath that story is a reality shaped just as much by biology as by choice. For many, what looks like drive is actually an old survival reflex, the nervous system pushing them to stay busy because slowing down once felt unsafe. Hustle becomes a performance not of ambition, but of vigilance. Hustle thrives because it fits neatly with cultural and organizational expectations. Companies profit when employees normalize overwork, and individuals receive praise for sacrifices that leave invisible costs. Checking email during vacation or pushing through illness may be openly rewarded as commitment, even though these behaviors often stem from the same reflexes that once kept someone alert in unstable homes. What began as a nervous system guarding against rejection or disapproval now gets reframed as professional strength. That cycle is reinforced when applause follows. But the truth is simpler. If staying late has become the measure of commitment, it's worth asking whether that measure is costing your health, your energy, and your goals in the long run. The cost is not hidden forever. Research has made clear that chronic stress and exhaustion carry measurable consequences, disrupting immune function, increasing risk for chronic disease, and eroding mental health. Burnout is not just about feeling drained. It alters how the body recovers, how the brain maintains focus, and how relationships hold together. At home, it shows up when someone keeps their phone at the dinner table, restless if they haven't replied to a message. On weekends, it shows when relaxation feels impossible without guilt. Over time, partners sense disconnection, children feel absence, and health begins to wear down, even as colleagues may still call it productivity. If hustle sounds like an identity, that is because trauma often linked worth with performance early on. Many who grew up with conditional approval learned that their place in a family depended on output. Stay quiet, stay useful, stay busy. At work, the same rule is triggered. A glance from a manager feels like a test, a deadline feels like a judgment, and the safe response is to double output. What looks like choice is often compulsion repeating in another context. That's why hustle feels so difficult to step back from. It was never just a work strategy. It was survival strategy carried forward. When culture claps for it, the reinforcement grows even stronger. Shifting this pattern doesn't require rejecting work or ambition. It requires recognizing when the push is no longer a choice, but a reflex. For viewers, one small experiment is more effective than trying to flip the entire system overnight. Choose one boundary this week, maybe silencing notifications after a set hour, saying no to one non-essential meeting, or leaving your desk for dinner without returning to the laptop. Try it for 3 days. Pay close attention to how your body reacts. Does anxiety spike? Does relief appear? Does fatigue lift even a little? That experiment is information, not judgment. It allows you to test whether the cost of hustle is worth the applause it brings. The myth of hustle will continue to circulate because it benefits organizations and disguises depletion as loyalty. But awareness loosens its grip. When you start noticing that exhaustion is framed as commitment, you can consciously question whether the trade is serving you. The point is not to reject work, but to shift the foundation on which you do it. Ambition that comes from choice feels steady. Drive that comes from compulsion drains you. Recognizing the difference lets you redirect energy toward real goals rather than toward survival scripts running in the background. And it is in that space, where you begin questioning the cost of hustle, that the next insight emerges. Productivity was never just about tools or hours. It has always been about whether the patterns written long ago are still shaping how you work today. Productivity isn't about packing more color-coded tasks into your day. It begins with safety, teaching your body that rest, focus, and boundaries don't threaten connection. The simplest takeaway: start with awareness. Even one 60-second check-in, shoulders down, one steady breath, can begin shifting old patterns that once kept you braced. To ground this in practice, I'd like to hear from you. Comment one pattern you recognize in yourself and one tiny healing habit you'll try this week. If this landed, drop a message so we know to make more on this topic. And if you want more tools like these, subscribe and stay connected.